She slammed the door so hard the pictures on the hallway shelf rattled, and she just stood there shouting at Dad like she could bulldoze him into agreeing. I was halfway up the stairs, phone buzzing in my hand with screenshots I'd taken that morning, and my legs felt like someone had drained the air out of them. "You're ruining this for me," she screamed. "You're trying to take away my dream." Her voice was sharp, practiced, like she'd rehearsed the victim part 1,000 times. Dad didn't flinch. He folded his arms and said, "I'm not going to bankroll emotional blackmail, Madison." Hearing him call her by name and not smooth her over felt foreign and steady. Madison's face went white then red. She started listing the guests, the vendors, the special requests like each one was a justified demand instead of an itemized list of control. "You don't get to take this from me. Do you know what I've done for this? You don't understand what this means for the family." Aaron's name drifted from a quiet phone call in the kitchen, friends and cousins watching from the doorway like they were waiting for a scene to end. Mom hovered, clutching a tissue box like it might stitch the air back together. She kept saying, "Sweetie, we just want you to be happy." Madison turned that into evidence that anyone who questioned her plans was trying to sabotage her life. I watched the way she used Mom's softness like a shield. I felt calmer than I expected. Maybe it was the screenshots burning a hole in my pocket, or maybe it was the years of packing my nerves into small boxes and promising myself I wouldn't do that today. I climbed the last 3 steps and stood in the doorway, phone out, and said, "Mom, Dad, I need you to look at this." My voice didn't tremble. For the first time, I didn't sound like a kid trying to be heard. I sounded like someone reporting facts. Madison spotted the phone and lunged. "You don't get to," she started, but Dad put his hand up. He said, "Let her speak." His tone stopped her like a stop sign. I pulled up the spreadsheet and walked them through it. I explained the mandatory deposits, the line items for hair, makeup, the fittings, the bachelorette trips with price tags that read like ransom demands. I showed the line where bridesmaids were expected to buy a $260 dress and pay for alterations, and the note where she tracked who bought what gift. "She's tracking gifts like a ledger," I said. She wrote who's allowed to give what and said she'd return anything that didn't match. There was a silence after that. Not the polite kind, but the raw, empty silence of people gambling their assumptions and losing. Dad asked, "Is this real?" I tapped through messages where Madison had told Mom our kids would suffer if she didn't get every cent. I showed the email chain where she redirected vendors through a joint account and the threads demanding deposits to lock spots. I showed the note where she told me to stop eating certain foods and called me fat, the schedule for mandatory hair and skin appointments. All of it neat, clinical, and terrifying. Madison's face collapsed into a kind of hard, incredulous smile. "You're lying," she said. "You're making things up to make me look bad." She flipped the conversation into personal attack mode like she always did. She tried to paint me as jealous, as someone petty and small. "You've always wanted attention," she hissed. "You want to ruin something that's mine." That was the old pattern. She weaponized childhood stories, old hurts, even the time Mom was hospitalized after I was born, she turned them into leverage. But this time Mom didn't bat it away. Mom's eyes filled with shame and then anger. She said, "I listened to you, Madison, and I let you convince me of things I shouldn't have." She said it quietly, but it was heavy. Dad's jaw tightened and he said, "We are not taking money from the kids' accounts. That stops now." Madison went for the nuclear option. She started talking about grandchildren like it was a threat. "You'll never see your grandchildren if you take this from me," she spat. She used the idea of future kids like a sword, trying to cut off any empathy my parents might feel. Dad's face got hard. He said, "Do not use that on us. I will not be anyone's emotional punching bag. Postpartum depression didn't give you permission to hurt people forever." She screamed louder, saying it wasn't fair, that no one supported her, that no one understood how much work she'd put into making the proposal perfect. She tried to make herself the martyr while she'd been building a fortress of rules and debts around everyone else. I felt something inside me finally settle, a quiet knowledge that I'd been right to guard myself, to plan to get out early and take control of my money. When I laid out the timeline of what she'd asked of bridesmaids, who'd paid deposits, and which vendors were already sent money, Mom covered her mouth like she might vomit. Dad's hand shook as he dialed the bank to check the children's accounts. The very idea that savings meant for college could be siphoned away made Dad explode into a kind of fury I'd never seen. "She had no right," he said through clenched teeth. "Not without both of us knowing." Madison tried one last manipulation, telling a cousin that we were the ones ruining everything, that we were selfish. But chess pieces were moving now, relationships were changing. My brothers were called home. My godmother was texted the receipts. The meeting splintered into logistics and apologies and the first shaky outlines of boundaries. She left that night, but not quietly. She packed a bag and walked out into the street with the echo of her threats still hanging in the doorway. "You'll regret this," she said over her shoulder, voice sharp and final. Dad didn't answer. Mom just stood in the hall, hands empty, eyes wet. I breathed in the house that suddenly felt both smaller and clearer at the same time. The facade was cracked, things were exposed. I felt like I could finally see the map of what needed fixing. After she left, the house felt like the smoke after a fire, stinging and hard to breathe in, except there wasn't really smoke. I sat at the bottom of the stairs and let the phone go dark. I needed to tell them things that had been sitting inside me for years, and now the doorway was open. "You need to know how she was with me," I said to Mom and Dad, my voice steady, like I'd been rehearsing this in my head for months. They pulled chairs close and waited. I told them I was 19 and the second youngest of 5, like they didn't already know, but I wanted to set the frame. Madison, my eldest sister and the one engaged now, is 25, 6 years older than me. Growing up, she never treated me like a sister. She treated me like an object that could be turned when useful. Even at 9, she liked rules and control more than dolls and songs. She was always the boss, I said, and I was always the thing that had to fit into her bossing. I explained the darkest thing that had been hushed in our house. When I was a baby, Mom had severe postpartum depression and needed a long stay in treatment. Our mom, my mother, was away for a while and a nanny and other relatives helped. Madison was 5 then, and whatever abandonment she felt turned into resentment aimed at me. One night she tried to smother me with a pillow, I said, and the words landed heavy. Mom's hands began to shake. She finally said, "We handled it then." But I said, "You handled it like it was a private thing, like it could be wrapped up and put on a shelf." That's how it went for years. The thing that should have been a red flag became a joke. Adults smoothed it over. Therapists smiled, took the easy path, and then stopped asking hard questions because Madison said what they wanted to hear. She's good at telling people what they want to hear. She learns the script, I told them. Then she performs. It made her danger quiet and tidy, which let her keep doing the dangerous things. Sorry for the quick interruption. If you're enjoying this so far, don't forget to hit that like button, subscribe, and leave comment below. It really helps the channel grow. Alright, let's jump back into the story. I told them how she weaponized attention. She learned that the minute people focused on someone else, she could turn the game. If Mom listened to my problems, Madison would start a fight about something small and loud to pull eyes back. If Dad praised me for a grade or a job, Madison would point out something I supposedly did wrong and the room would shift. It wasn't subtle, I said. It was consistent. I remember thinking, as a kid, that if you could make everyone look at one thing, you could make everyone ignore the rest. When she grew up, she got better at practice. She could charm relatives, do the right thing in church, laugh on cue at family gatherings, and then slam you in private until you were too small to respond. I said she could make adults feel sorry for her even when she was the one hurting people. Mom's face changed from defensiveness to confusion, like she was looking at a version of her daughter she'd never met. Dad's hands kept balling into fists. He said, "We should have caught this earlier." I said, "We all should have." I told them about the tactics she used when she wanted control. She'd detail a story about being overlooked as a child and then add little facts to the story until it stuck in people's heads like a varnish. She'd make herself the victim in a story where she had been the one pushing. Then she'd ask for favors, big ones. The wedding had been the latest. It started small, I said. Flowers, ideas, a color palette. Then it became orders, deposits, schedules. Rules about hair, skin, gifts, everything. Their faces went pale as I walked them through the pattern. I pointed out how she turned therapy into part of the performance. When someone asked hard questions, she gave the answers they wanted to hear, I said. Then therapy would end and the behavior stayed. That was how she hid. That was how she got Mom to think dipping into the kids' accounts was compassionate, not theft. She framed it as family sacrifice instead of a one-sided debt. The longer I spoke, the more I could see Mom's eyes fill with a kind of shame I'd never seen before. They listened, really listened, like the thin shell of stories they'd used to explain things was cracking. Dad finally said what I'd needed someone to say out loud for a long time. We protected her feelings and forgot to protect our kids. Those words felt like a door opening. I realized we could name the harm and start to fix the consequences. The evening ended with a plan to call the bank, to pull paperwork together, and to get everyone into family therapy. It felt like the first honest thing we had said in years, and I felt tired but strangely calm knowing the map was finally on the table. She put a ring on and turned immediate into obsession. Within days of the engagement, Madison was all logistics and lists, like someone who'd swallowed a wedding planning book whole. I found out I was a bridesmaid by text before she'd even spoken to me about it. "You're in," the message read, no please, no ask, just a command. I stared at my phone and felt my stomach drop because this wasn't a request, it was an instruction. The rules came next, one after another until they were a paper wall. She had picked a specific blush dress that cost $260, and she insisted everyone buy it new. Shoes, makeup, hair, all on our tabs. Then she added mandatory beauty appointments every 6 weeks, which meant paying again and again for treatments we didn't ask for. She said we had to hide tattoos or cover them with special makeup, and anyone with colorful hair had to wear a wig or dye it natural for the day. It felt like she wanted us to be copies, not people. She announced that every bridesmaid must attend every tasting and every fitting. No exceptions, she wrote in a group chat and put an exclamation mark like it was law. She set mandatory trips, a one-day bachelorette billed like a spa escape for $750, and a weekend at a luxury hotel that she priced near $1,000. She wanted us to be present and picture perfect for every staged memory, and she expected us to foot the bill for her dream as if that was normal. She even added reservation fees for guests, a kind of charity-style deposit to save spots at events. "We need commitment so vendors don't get left holding the bill," she argued in messages to Mom, but the line between locking in guests and making people pay to love her felt thin and ugly. I started counting up what she was asking, and it felt like the numbers were strangling people I loved. I made a list and my hands shook when I showed it to Mom, thinking she'd see it and say, "This is too much." Mom didn't. She smiled weakly and said, "It's bride anxiety, honey, she's overwhelmed." She put her hand on my arm like that would smooth the math away. "We'll help where we can," she said, and I could see Madison's whisper in her ear had already started working. The kindness in Mom turned into a blind spot. Mom wanted to be supportive of her daughter, and Madison knew that. She piled on the guilt like ribbons. Madison kept a gift spreadsheet that read like an inventory list. Who was bringing what clockwork present, who was giving cash, who was bringing something on theme. She threatened to return gifts that didn't fit her aesthetic, saying she wanted the wedding to look cohesive, like a curated photo shoot rather than a family gathering. I remember thinking it was petty at first and then feeling sick because it was controlling, telling people how to love you, how to prove they cared with receipts. When I pushed back and said, "This is too expensive, Mom, I can't pay all of this," Madison turned on the drama. "You're choosing to be small," she said in a voice she uses on people she wants to shame. "If you cared about me, you'd make it work." She made it a morality test. I felt the old pattern kick in where my wants were framed as cruelty. Mom's face clouded with guilt and she said, "I don't want her to be unhappy," before she could think about what she was doing to our finances. I tried to set boundaries. I said, "I will stand by you, but I won't take out loans for this. I won't go into debt." I told her I'd come to fittings when I could afford it and that I wouldn't fly to every event. She acted hurt, like I'd stabbed her, and the group chat filled with passive-aggressive messages that read like threats. "You'll be marked down," she wrote once, and a friend asked if Madison was joking. No one laughed. The more I saw, the worse it got. Vendors were funneled through a joint wedding email she controlled. People were asked to wire deposits to accounts I didn't recognize. She'd text Mom privately with lines about family legacy and how this wedding would be the moment we'd all be proud. She framed her demands as sacrifice and us as selfish. It was gaslighting dressed up as tradition. I started making contingency plans that week. I looked at student housing, opened a new bank account without Mom on it, and talked to my godmother about keeping records of payments. I felt like I was building a lifeboat while the ship filled with expectation. Talking to Dad about it felt different because he listened in a way he hadn't earlier. He asked direct questions and promised to check the children's accounts. I realized protection didn't look like silence. It looked like paperwork, boundaries, and saying no out loud. Madison's obsession didn't slow. If anything, the rules became more detailed, more invasive. She wanted uniform bows, matching jewelry, promises written down that read like contracts. Every demand was a way to own the day and everyone in it. For me, standing up wasn't just about money, it was about refusing to be trimmed into someone else's spotlight at the cost of my future. I felt tired, but also clearer than I had in years about what I would and wouldn't give. I started pulling things together like evidence, because if I was going to ask for change, I needed more than feelings. I sat at the kitchen table with a stack of printouts and old emails, and I texted my godmother to tell her what I was doing. I wanted the facts to be clean and impossible to spin. It felt strange to be the one doing the sleuthing in my own home, but after years of holding my tongue, I'd learned how easy it was for stories to be rewritten unless someone wrote down the truth. Dad still didn't know Mom had even talked about taking money from the kids' accounts. He thought the savings were untouchable, a promise for college, housing, or a quiet start when we left home. "We saved that for you," he'd always say when I brought up school like it was a private bank of trust. I found the account statements in a drawer after asking him where the kids' files were kept. He had planned to transfer my share to me when I turned 20, which felt like breathing room for what I needed next. When I told him what Mom had been saying, his face grew tight and small in a way I hadn't seen before. The math was ugly and simple once I lined it up. Our parents had been setting aside about $21,000 for each of us, a little nest egg to be released when we left for post-secondary plans. That money was real and marked. I found bank folders and a spreadsheet where Dad had been tracking each child's account. Then I dug into messages between Mom and Madison where the idea of redirecting savings had been floated. Mom had written about helping Madison cover some wedding costs, calling it family investment. Madison had answered with a careful script about legacy, how people would remember the family for this moment, and little reminders about being overlooked as a child. Madison had framed her childhood stories like proof. She'd remind Mom about the time she felt left out when our mother was sick after I was born and use it to paint herself as the wounded one who deserved repair. She made it sound like giving up the money would heal that old hurt, I told Dad. He held the printouts and went quiet, flipping pages like he was trying to understand how he could have missed it. He said, I never agreed to that, not for a second. The more I read, the worse it got. Mom had written notes about vendor quotes and there was a line item list that added up to a $95,000 wedding. Madison had helped format the list and suggested where family funds could go. There were messages where she made it sound like a family legacy investment instead of an expensive, one-sided wish list. It wasn't a normal set of asks. It was leverage dressed in wedding planning. I remember the moment Dad found the records himself. He sat at the dining table with the folder open and his face went white. He said, "This can't be real." I slid into the chair opposite him and answered, "It is, Dad. She's been making plans and talking about dipping into children's accounts." His hands shook when he picked up his phone. He dialed Mom and then Madison like a man waking from a long sleep into a house he thought he owned. His voice when he came back was small and sharp. How could she think that was okay? Dad looked at me with something I hadn't felt from him in years, clear, steady protection. He said, "You were meant to have this money for your future. I was going to transfer it to you when you turned 20. Hearing him say the plan out loud felt like the ground setting under my feet. At once I stopped feeling like a kid in the middle of other people's drama and started to feel like someone who had a legal and moral right to my future. We called Mom into the kitchen. Her face was an open map of guilt and defensiveness. She said, "I thought I was helping." She kept saying it like that explained things. I showed her the messages where she had signed off on ideas where she'd written about how this wedding could be a family project. I told her the exact numbers. She looked at the line items and the way Madison had framed them and said, "I didn't think it would come to this." I said, "But you considered it. You really thought about taking from our accounts." She covered her mouth and cried. I only wanted her to be happy. Dad was furious in a quiet, controlled way that made the air feel brittle. He said, "We do not touch those accounts without both of us agreeing." He was angry about the betrayal more than the money at that moment, angry that the trust was used as a bargaining chip. He added, "We have to fix this. We have to make sure no one can move that money without both our signatures." I felt a wave of relief as he said it out loud. For the first time, I felt protected by the idea that paperwork and names on accounts could do what words hadn't. Stop Madison from stealing futures. We started a list of actions then and there. Call the bank, change account access, pull everything into one place so no one could quietly reroute it again. Dad made notes with his hands still trembling. He said, "We're going to put it into a long-term vehicle for you and I'll transfer your portion early if you want." I swallowed hard and felt something like gratitude and grief at once. Gratitude for protection at last, and grief for the years the plan could have been lost if I hadn't pushed. That night I slept poorly, but not from fear. I slept from being both exhausted and strangely relieved. The house felt different knowing we had a path forward. The numbers no longer hung like a threat, they felt like a map of how to rebuild trust. I knew fixing the money was only the start, but it was a start I'd wanted for years. Now it was finally happening. He sounded like a man who finally woke up. Dad called Madison and told her to come home, his voice low and sharp like someone who had run out of patience. She came, and when she walked back into the house, she was all sugar and charm because relatives were there. My godmother Leela sat in the living room with her hands folded like she was waiting for a sermon. Madison laughed and smiled and said, "Isn't this exciting?" As if the only thing on her mind was a dress. That performance lasted until we were alone in the kitchen. The door clicked and the smile fell away like a mask. She turned on us hard and fast, like she'd been saving the worst words for the moment she thought she could break us privately. "You're trying to ruin my life," she said, voice sharp. "If you take this away from me, you're taking our family apart. You'll never see grandchildren." She used grandchildren like a knife, aiming to cut empathy out of Dad and Mom so she could keep control. Dad's face didn't change the way it used to. He didn't pout or give in. He told her, "You do not get to threaten us with grandchildren." He said it quietly, but it hit like a brick. "Threats and emotional manipulation stop now. This isn't how we solve things." He called out the entitlement in her tone, saying, "You don't get to decide where the money goes without both of us agreeing." The house felt raw, like someone had pulled a curtain back and the light was too bright. Madison tried other tactics. She dialed the pity, saying no one had supported her, that she'd been the one who sacrificed for the family. She painted herself as the forever giver who deserved payoff now. "You always made me the adult," she said, voice shaking. I've waited, and now you want to take this joy away." She kept circling back to the same old childhood story about being overlooked when Mom was sick after I was born. It was the script she'd used for years to pry open good intentions and make people pay. Dad didn't let the story close the case this time. He said, postpartum depression doesn't give you the right to use people forever. You need therapy. You need to stop weaponizing pain. He spoke like someone who had read the long pattern and decided it was finally time to name it. He told her he wouldn't be anyone's emotional punching bag and he wouldn't allow Mom to be guilted into handing over money. We're adults, he said. We'll get help, but no one takes someone else's future as a bargaining chip. Mom's face was torn between panic and relief. She kept saying, I didn't know it would get this big. She sounded small. Leela reached over and took her hand like you do when someone you love is about to fall. My brothers were texting and I could hear one of them saying he'd be home in a few days. The family was gathering like a net under the avalanche. It felt ugly and necessary. Madison ratcheted up the pressure. She started talking about cutting ties, making dramatic proclamations that she'd never speak to us again if we didn't capitulate. Fine, she said at one point, voice loud and full of poison, I'll remove myself. I'll remove all of you. You'll regret it. She tried to make leaving sound like sacrifice. She tried to make her exit feel like punishment for those who wouldn't enable her. Dad didn't flinch. He asked her to sit down and listen to what everyone had to say. He told her there would be boundaries and that she would have to respect them. He said, we will not be blackmailed. We will not lose our children's futures. He told her she needed therapy and that she needed to stop making threats. He made clear rules in a way that had nothing to do with anger and everything to do with protection. For the first time in a long time, I felt seen. I felt my words land in a room with grown-ups who were ready to act. I told them about the spreadsheet, the deposits, and the demands. I said, I will not be forced to pay for a life I cannot afford. I said it plain. Mom reached for my hand and didn't pull away. Dad said, you will not be forced to attend. You will not pay these costs. He looked at Madison and said it like a verdict. They agreed to restructure the plans so I wouldn't be on the hook for anything. Dad promised to transfer my reserved funds early if I wanted them and to pay back a small loan I'd taken for tuition. Mom apologized and said she'd been manipulated, that she'd let guilt decide for her where her money went. It wasn't a clean fix, but it was a fix. Boundaries were set. No tapping into the kids' accounts without both signatures, no mandatory events, and counseling for everyone. Madison packed a bag that night and left in an Uber, her voice loud enough to ride down the street. She kept saying she'd cut us off and that we'd regret it. The door closed behind her like the end of a scene in a play. I felt a weird mix of emptiness and clarity. She was gone, at least for that night, and the house was quieter in a way that felt possible rather than brittle. Later, while dishes clinked and people tried to act like anything normal could be salvaged after an argument like that, I sat at the table and wrote down what had happened. Names, dates, messages, the bank statements, everything that had been weaponized. It felt like building a shield. For once, when I said my truth, someone listened and did something about it. The family wasn't fixed, but the path forward was clearer. We had boundaries now, and that was the start of us getting better. I told them about the pillow first because the memory was the sharpest thing I had. I said, when I was a toddler, Madison tried to smother me with a pillow. The kitchen went quiet like someone had cut the soundboard. My words felt ridiculous and huge at the same time, like saying them made them true in a room that had always preferred softer truths. Mom's hands flew to her mouth and she whispered, we thought we'd handled it. Dad's face folded into something between horror and shame. Mom explained what happened for her, that after I was born, she had severe postpartum depression and needed an extended stay in treatment. She said, I was not myself then. I couldn't be present the way I should have. She told us about the baby monitors, the relatives who came over to help, the nanny who stayed for months. Hearing her say it out loud changed the story in my head. It didn't make the incident smaller, but it made the cause clearer. There were cracks in our family that never got fixed, and Madison had stepped into those cracks and learned to live there. I said how the family had turned the incident into a hushed anecdote. It became one of those grim stories we joked about at holidays, I told them. Something adults would say with a laugh that sounded like it was glued on. That shrug made me angry then, and it made me angry now. A dangerous moment became a way to get attention rather than a sign that something needed real work. Mom's voice trembled when she said she'd been too ashamed to make it public, or to push for a real intervention that might have held Madison accountable. We learned that Madison had been in therapy as a child. I remember Mom saying she talked a lot in sessions. She said the things therapists wanted to hear. It sounded like a compliment at first and then like a warning. Madison had gotten good at patterning herself to what adults expected, saying the right words to get the right outcome. She learned to charm clinicians into signing off. She performed, I said, and Dad repeated the word like it was honest medicine. That habit of performing stuck into her adult life. Same scripts, different stage. Hearing about her discharge made the pieces fit in a sick way. She wasn't cured because she could lie on demand. She was released because she could give scripted answers that made professionals comfortable. That explained how she later used therapy talk as armor to dodge responsibility. It explained how she could cry at the right time and then weaponize that performance into guilt to get what she wanted. I could see the pattern clearly. Mask pain, perform normal, then manipulate the adults around her until they let her have her way. Dad got quiet for a long time and then he said, "We mistook performance for recovery." He sounded half furious and half devastated. "We should have kept asking hard questions," Mom said, wiping her eyes. Those admissions felt heavy but necessary. It was the first time I'd heard both parents name the gap between what looked like help and what was really happening. Naming it made it less mystical and more fixable, like a broken hinge you could oil or replace. We talked about how those early fractures turned into a long game of manipulation. Madison had learned every lever: attention, guilt, shame, and used them when she wanted control. She'd become an expert at telling stories that made other people take the fall. I told them how, as I got older, I could predict when she'd switch from kindness to cruelty. "She times it," I said. "She waits until someone's soft or tired and then she strikes where it hurts." The family sat with that for a long time, like swallowing a bitter pill. My brothers were called home. They flew in within days with hugs that weren't casual and questions that needed answers. Leela, my godmother, pushed for family therapy and said, "You can't just patch this with apologies." That line felt like a rope thrown into the dark. We agreed to see a counselor together and to set rules for how we talked to each other about money, events, and past wounds. The plan was practical and small at first: paperwork, boundaries, a schedule for sessions, but it felt like a frame we could build on. The night we agreed to therapy and boundaries, I felt a strange mix of relief and grief. Relief because at last the family could see how deep the problem went, and grief because it had been allowed to fester so long. I made a promise to myself then, to be different when I had power, to show up for the youngest child in our house in a way nobody had shown up for me. I would be present, steady, and honest. That promise was the first piece of my own healing, and it felt like something I could start on immediately. She left in an Uber like she wanted us to feel the echo of the door closing after her. Her last words hung in the driveway while the car's engine swallowed them. "I'm done with all of you, don't expect to ever see me again." I didn't feel small when she walked away. I felt oddly unmoved, like someone who'd been waiting for a storm to break and now could see the clean sky after it passed. The house settled into a different kind of quiet, not fragile but steady, and I knew the hard part of fixing things was about to start. Dad moved first, the way he does when he decides something has to be done. He sat me down at the kitchen table and said, "We'll make this right for you." His voice was worn but certain. He told me he would transfer my reserved funds early so I could get the help I needed for school. I felt a tightness in my chest that wasn't relief exactly, more like recognition that the safety net we'd been promised was finally being thrown across the gap. He also said he'd cover the small cancellation fee on the short-term loan I'd taken when Madison pressured me into paying a vendor deposit. He didn't make it dramatic, he just said, "You won't be punished for her choices." Mom sat across from us, and she cried without shame for the first time I could remember. She kept saying, "I'm sorry, I'm so sorry." The apology wasn't perfect and it didn't erase what happened, but it was real. She promised she would not touch any of the kids' accounts without Dad's explicit agreement, and that she would work with me to make sure my first year at university and housing were covered. Those words closed a lot of small, gnawing fears I'd been carrying about how I'd manage rent and tuition if I refused to be part of Madison's plans. We made a list that night: concrete things to do, because promises in our family usually needed a paper trail to stick. Dad wrote down steps: call the bank, change access permissions, transfer my funds into a protected long-term account, and arrange an early payment for my tuition and housing. He also agreed to pay back the small loan I'd taken. Seeing his handwriting next to each item felt absurdly healing, like someone had finally put the house back in order after a messy windstorm. Therapy was non-negotiable. Mom and Dad said we would start family counseling and I could pick my own therapist for individual sessions. I remember saying out loud, "I want someone who sees patterns, not just feelings." Leela, my godmother, had pushed for a professional who understood manipulative behavior and family trauma. Within 2 weeks we had a schedule and the rooms lined up: individual sessions for me and them, and group sessions that would include the brothers when they came home. My brothers flew in from their postings on short leave, looking like kids with bags of grown-up problems. They hugged me like they meant it and then sat down to listen. One of them said, "We should have been here sooner," and I didn't scold him. Instead, I felt grateful. Their presence mattered more than words could say. Having them in the sessions and in the house made everything feel less like a family argument and more like a family problem people were finally willing to solve together. Setting boundaries with Mom was painful but necessary. We began laying down simple rules about money, events, and how to handle Madison if she reached out. I told Mom I needed honesty and transparency, not explanations that tried to make her feel better while leaving the harm in place. She accepted it slowly, sometimes clumsily, but she showed up. We started weekly check-ins where we talked about accounts, school deadlines, and how to support each other without falling back into old guilt patterns. Those small rituals fixed a lot of loose threads. The weeks that followed were messy and hopeful at the same time. There were arguments and tears, yes, but there were also practical wins: bank paperwork completed, a deposit for my dorm paid, a clear plan for my tuition. The family therapy sessions were hard, people dug into things they'd kept locked away. But the sessions also gave us a language to describe what had been going on for years. Saying the words out loud, manipulation, gaslighting, entitlement, made them less dangerous. It didn't heal everything instantly, but it started the real work. Madison didn't come back into our lives. She texted once, venom wrapped in nostalgia, and I didn't answer. I watched the family shift instead. Mom and I talked more honestly, Dad stayed steady and practical, and my brothers took turns calling to check on school plans. I started planning to move to university housing sooner, feeling the security of knowing funds and support were in place. The future felt less like a cliff and more like a path I could walk on my own, with people who had finally started to protect me. They cut us out and the world kept turning. Weeks later, I heard through cousins and aunts that Madison and Aaron had bought a place together and were moving forward with the wedding without us. They said your band, my cousin texted, the message short and awkward. I read it with my coffee cold in my hand and felt a strange looseness where fury might have been. It didn't hit like a loss so much as a quiet closing of a door I'd already stopped wanting to walk through. I didn't try to crash anything. I wanted the truth more than the drama. Friends who attended sent small updates, photos of the flowers, the blush dresses sitting in perfect lines, people laughing with filters on. One aunt said, "It's beautiful, but it felt staged." Another cousin messaged, "There was an awkward moment with Aaron's side. They told me about the groom's mother inviting an ex in the hope of stirring trouble. She wanted a scene," my cousin said, "but it didn't blow up. It fizzled." People talked and then moved on, like someone had tried to light a fire with damp wood. At the reception, there was a slideshow with photos from their life together and the usual sentimental music. I heard the part that everyone paused on from a dozen different phones. The image of a tiny ultrasound filled the screen. Then words showed up in block letters, "Due next summer." Someone in a group chat put 3 crying emojis and then a heart. My first reaction was neutral disbelief, then a slow, steady ache because of what that little announcement meant: new life, new problems, and a life path Madison chose that did not include us. I felt oddly detached and also strangely relieved not to be dragged into the performance of it all. People asked me if it hurt, and sometimes it did. I missed having a sister with whom life had been easy, with shared jokes and family rituals, but mostly I felt safety. Without her constant pulling, I noticed small things that used to be invisible. Mom laughed more often in the kitchen, Dad stopped flinching when his phone buzzed, and the youngest got to be small without Madison trying to make everything about herself. "This is better," my godmother said once, fingers wrapped around a mug. "It might be hard, but it's better." I agreed and meant it. The family I had left behind when I was a child was not the same as the one I was reclaiming now. I moved into residence earlier than planned. The dorm room was tiny and still smelled like fresh paint, but it was mine. I walked around and put books on shelves, a small lamp on the desk, a photo of my dog next to an acceptance letter taped to the wall. The first night I cried a little, not because I was leaving home, but because I felt the clean air that comes after making a hard choice. I paid my first month rent with Dad's early transfer and felt the panic in my chest ease into something like steadiness. I was learning how to take a breath that didn't come with a price. Therapy became a steady thing, not an occasional, awkward appointment. "You can set the pace," my therapist told me on our 3rd session. I learned phrases to name what had happened: gaslighting, boundary trauma, childhood neglect. I learned to notice when I was shrinking at a look or tensing at a question. "You don't have to fix her," my therapist said, and the words opened space in me to stop carrying what wasn't mine. Sessions were difficult and also oddly freeing, like pulling out stitches that had held me tight for years. I found someone who made being seen feel gentle and real. He's in the military and understands the weird schedules and sudden moves. "You don't have to explain all of it in one night," he told me on our 2nd date, and the way he said it felt like permission to be real and messy. He listens when I tell the story and doesn't try to fix every piece. He calls my brother to coordinate visits sometimes, and that small act meant the world to me. It felt like having a partner who wanted to build, not demand. My oldest brother got engaged, and his fiancée has been kind in ways that surprised me. She called me one evening and said, "I know things are messy. I want you to feel welcome." Her voice was steady and small, and it landed like a soft hand. We've met across provinces and text often about wedding planning that actually includes everyone without threats or secret spreadsheets. She asks what's comfortable and listens when I say no to certain traditions. That respect taught me how boundaries could exist even in celebrations. Losing Madison as a sister still stings on certain days. I catch myself imagining a future where things were different, and then I remember the cold lists and the tracking spreadsheets and the threats. I remember Dad standing up in the kitchen and saying no, and Mom finally saying sorry in a way that meant she meant it. I remember the youngest looking at me for bedtime stories without the room twisting into someone else's drama. Those memories, small and true, built a new story for me. I keep working on myself and on the family that stayed. We go to therapy, we have hard conversations, and sometimes we mess up. We also celebrate things without strings attached. I chose safety, boundaries, and a future that doesn't hinge on someone else's demands. I lost a sister, yes, but I gained a clearer path forward and people who actually protect each other. That feels like a real kind of love. Thanks for watching. Make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next video. And drop a comment below, I'd love to hear your thoughts.